Welcome everyone to the ECG crash course. Today we'll be going through sick sinus syndrome. So what is a sick sinus syndrome? So it's basically a bunch of disorders where the sinoatrial node is feeling a bit under the weather, and so it's a bunch of bradyarrhythmias. So there's different types of sick sinus syndrome that we need to be able to recognise on an ECG. So we'll go through that now. So this is our first example of a sick sinus syndrome. If I get my pen out, we can go through it. So the first most obvious thing that you can see that's already sticking out is this massive pause here. So this looks like a 3-second pause, and we can see that the sinoatrial node is firing off because we can see a P wave here followed by a QRS followed by a T wave. You see another sinus beat, another sinus beat, another sinus beat, and then suddenly there's no P waves and QRSs at all. And then we get this mysterious QRS here, which doesn't have any preceding P wave, so we can classify this as a junctional beat. And then eventually we get the sinus node switching on again, and then that forms our normal sinus beat and our normal sinus beat again. So sometimes the sinus node can just temporarily become lazy, causing a sinus pause, and this would be an example of a sinus pause. So our next example is this one here, where we can see a P wave, a QRS and a T wave, followed by another sinus beat, followed by another sinus beat, and then we suddenly get this massive, and it's still continuing on, massive pause here, until we get a P wave, a QRS and a T wave, until we get the sinus node firing again. This massive pause is called a sinus arrest because the sinus node is completely just given up for a very long time, and that's called a sinus arrest. Sometimes the sinoatrial node can become constipated. So what do I mean by that? Or how does it look? What does a constipated sinoatrial node look like on an ECG? Well, if we look at this example here, we can see P waves, QRS, a T wave, and another P wave, a QRS, and a T wave. So we can call these sinus beats. Then we get what looks like a sinus pause, because we get a bit of a delay, a bit of area where there's no electrical conduction at all, and then we get the P wave. We get the P wave, QRS, and T wave showing up again. So we get sinus rhythm coming back, returning back to us. However, if you were to map out the P waves, so if you were to map out the P waves, and if you were to map out whatever one was here, well, let's imagine that was there. Basically, if you were to map out the P waves and then move it along, you'd see that there should have been a P wave here, there should have been a P wave here, and then obviously there is a P wave there. So there's a pattern to the electrical failure. So the sinoatrial node is attempting to produce a P wave, however it never manifests itself electrically because it never generates it in the end. And so we call that the sinoatrial node being constipated because there is an underlying pattern to it. It's not random, unlike a sinus pause where the pause can go off and then come back randomly with no sort of ability to map the P waves out. So we call this a sinoatrial exit block, which is just another type of sick sinus syndrome that you need to be aware of. So remember, sinoatrial exit block. And again, it can be easily mistaken for a sinus pause. So one more thing to be aware of is something called tachybrady syndrome. And this is basically describing an ECG where there is a tachycardia. We can see that this is a sinus tachycardia, and with some SVEs. If you don't know what an SVE is, look at the supraventricular arrhythmia video, and then you get a sudden drop in rate. So you get a sudden bradycardia. So if you get a tachycardia followed by a bradycardia, we call that tachybrady syndrome. And that bradycardia can be due to a sinus arrest or a sinus pause. So that's just a specific name for a specific ECG finding where you see a tachycardia followed by a bradycardia. So it was a very short video. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful, and check out my other ECG videos and I'll catch you next time.